So I just picked up the Sony ZV-E1, and there's one lens that I decided to try out on this camera, which I think is actually a really cool option for people who have this camera, and that is the APS-C 10-18 Sony OSS stabilized lens. You might think you can't use an APS-C lens on this camera, but there's a couple really easy ways to make this lens work on this camera, like flawlessly, and you still have the like 11 to 18 millimeter range. And then with the addition of having that clear image zoom on your zoom rocker, you can make this kind of like a 10 to like a 70 mil lens. So let me just explain how I can kind of get this lens to actually work on this camera. Okay, so with this lens, when you normally put this in on this camera, you're going to get like vignetting on the sides and top because the APS-C lens is built for a smaller sensor. But the one really easy fix, especially with the ZV-E1, is you can put it into active stabilization or dynamic active stabilization. If you go to active stabilization, you will have to go to about 11 mils on the lens itself, and it'll completely remove that corner vignetting. You might get some of it that pops in a little bit if you're being really shaky and the OSS is working. But for me, what I can do is I can actually put it into dynamic stabilization. Let me change that. So now when I go into dynamic stabilization, we've pretty much completely removed that vignette, and now we're left with probably like a 12 millimeter lens. But now when you look at the setup on this camera, like this is very compact. Now it is an f4, but that just means you're going to get really good, like a little bit more in focus background. In fact, sometimes I think it's actually sharper looking, and most of the time when we're outdoors, I'm shooting in like f4 or higher anyways. But now you have this really compact, small setup vlog camera. Even if I have the cage on there, it's still small. Pair that with that brand new Sony shotgun mic, you have this really awesome, cool, compact setup that is very wide. Like if you look at the setting on this thing almost looks like a GoPro as far as how wide this thing actually is. So I think it's really cool. Plus, when you have dynamic stabilization on, you're going to get that like gimbal-like smoothness that you're going to get with dynamic stabilization. Only when you're using other lenses, dynamic sometimes gets too close to get that kind of good look wide lens, but that solves that with this lens. Another really cool thing about this lens is you can find this lens for as low as like $400 sometimes used. It's a pretty inexpensive lens compared to some of the G Masters and things like that. But I really like the idea of this if you want to get a lot of background and a lot of width in your shot. But also, you can switch this into an 18 millimeter, and then it's fine. You will get no vignetting anyways because you're past the point of that vignette on the zoom. The other really cool function with this is because you have that clear image zoom. Let's go around to Paul here. Paul's filming me once again in this video. Paul, let's zoom in on you here. So now we are at 1.5, we are at 2.0, we are going all the way to 4.0 zoom. So now we have this very big zoomed in lens. You are losing some of that 4K quality, but if you need it in a pinch, you have this like very big zoom lens, which is awesome, being that this is only a 10 to 18 lens. And you can change the zoom speed on this as well, but as you can see now we're back to the 18 millimeter. I can also go all the way back to the 10. Once again, you can go from 10 all the way with that zoom and zoom that into 4 times zoom. So now we're getting probably around a 40 to 50 millimeter range. And this thing works great, and it still has that dynamic stabilization. So I think this is kind of a cool, like if you need one lens to bring with you and you have the widest possible lens you could put on this camera at a very good price point, you can get all of your background and you still have the ability to zoom in with this camera. So this is a really kind of fun option, especially if you already own this lens. If you have a ZV-E10 and you want to upgrade to the ZV-E1, this is a cool lens that you can still use on this camera. The same thing can be kind of said with a lot of the APS-C lenses, because if you have that dynamic stabilization turned on, it's going to crop in enough to where it's getting rid of that like vignette. So now I will say that sometimes you don't necessarily want to have dynamic stabilization turned on all the time. In that case, you could put it down to active and then just like turn it to 11 or 12, and it's going to zoom in past that vignette anyway, so then you can just use that. All right, so if you want to check out what this lens looks like vlogging with it, let's just put it in dynamic stabilization. I'm at 10 millimeters. Easily can get me and Paul in the frame here, like without any question. It's not tight at all. Because it's f4, he's going to be actually in focus more. In fact, I'm actually in f8 right now because it's very sunny out here. By the way, for ZV-E1 owners, it is 97 degrees outside right now. We've been filming all day with this camera, in slow motion nonetheless. Have we overheated once?
No, I'm shocked.
Yeah.
The lens was super hot to hold in the hand, and the camera was still not overheating.
Yeah, I think we can kind of maybe put that to bed. If you're shooting for an hour in 4K 60, which I don't think you would ever do anyways, you might get some overheating. But we've been in the scorching hot Florida all weekend, had zero issues with overheating. So let's just do some walking tests here and kind of see how it looks vlogging. All right, so let's just start walking around with this thing. I'm just going to hold it underneath the camera. We are in dynamic, like I said. So the one thing is it's maybe a little tough to hold under the lens because it's such a small lens.
Yeah.
So let's just walk here. So with this dynamic stabilization, you're seeing how smooth this looks. I kind of think this looks a little bit like a gimbal walk here. It's maybe a little shaky. If you have big movements with the dynamic active stabilization, it will kind of get funky looking sometimes. But as you can see here, like vlogging with this is like super easy. I think it looks very stable. This is kind of eliminating the need for a gimbal for me, I think. Paul?
It's a very cheap wide setup. It looks great.
Yeah, let's just do kind of a POV version of doing this walkway and seeing how that looks, how stable this is. I am not using a gimbal for this. I'm just going to stop you right there if you guys call me out on it. Zero gimbal. We're going to just do a walk with dynamic stabilization on. So you can see, I'm not really trying to ninja walk much. I'm still trying to be kind of careful, but obviously I'm not really doing a lot to like stabilize this camera. So let's do that same thing with a stabilization just turned off to show you the comparison. All right, so now we're going to turn off stabilization altogether. I'm going to punch into about 12 to 13 millimeters just to kind of get that same focal range that you would get with that crop. So let's just do this. Same movements, ready to go. Okay, so that felt good. It looked pretty good. I could tell there was some bounces in the screen. The one nice thing about this though is that because I have such a wide lens, it's actually going to make it look more stable because it's not really punching around. If you have a more zoomed in lens, it's going to show that a lot more. But that's just going to show you the difference with that dynamic stabilization. I just kind of wanted to showcase that with this lens because it looks really good and it's very gimbal smooth. And if you do find that the stabilization kind of bounces into the corners a little bit in post, you could always punch that in like to 101%, 105%, something like that to completely eliminate them. But you're really only going to see that if the camera's moving a lot and the stabilization on the sensor is moving around. So anyways, you guys, that's what this lens looks like when vlogging, when walking in that dynamic stabilization. So normally my go-to lens is the Sony 16-35 G Master. As you can see here though, it is literally twice the size, it's definitely twice the weight, and it's definitely not making this camera any less compact with that lens. So having something like the 10-18 is going to be the smallest compact setup that you're going to be able to have for this camera. This is a really cool option on a budget. I think I paid like $400 for this lens myself. I know new, this is like I think $700, so if you want one of the smallest, most compact setups for the full frame Sony ZV-E1, check out the Sony 10-18. I preferably like the OSS lens because it is stabilized. It's older, so it is also a little bit more affordable, but I'm sure the same could be said about the new version of this lens as well. So if anyways, you guys, if you have any questions, any comments, if you want to let me know what you think of this, please leave me a comment down below. If this video has been a help in any way, please hit that like button. As always, guys, we'll catch you on the next one. I got to get back to Disneyland because paid a lot of money to come down to Florida here with Paul, and we're going to go have some fun at some of the parks. Catch you guys later.